This is An Empty World, written by Beryl Croops.
Patsy didn't remember the turns of the road so much as the sound the day made. Rain ticking against the Land Rover's windscreen, the wipers smearing grey water into a tired arc, the heater fan coughing lukewarm air that smelt faintly of wet wool. Her father kept glancing at the side mirror, then the rear view, then the side mirror again, like there was something back there he owed and couldn't pay. When a lorry growled past, he gripped the wheel hard enough for his knuckles to pale. He didn't speak. Not at the station, not on the narrow lanes home, not even when they pulled up in front of the farmhouse. A house so old it looked as if it had been put there first, and the fields had grown around it. 3 days since the funeral, and Patsy had practiced a dozen versions of the moment where he might say something, anything, to catch her as she fell. "Sorry, we'll manage. I've got you." But the only words in the car were the small ones the weather made and the quiet ones inside her chest, the ones that asked, over and over, "Am I really wanted? Am I just the last job you can't put off?" She had seen him on the platform even before the train slid in. She'd held her suitcase so tight the handle bit her palm. Some part of her, stubborn, childish, furious with hope, half expected her mother to be there instead. Sensible coat buttoned to the throat, a worried smile holding everything together like a pin. But it was only him, tall and tired, his shirt collar not quite straight, the face she knew only from a single photograph in a drawer. A man who shared her blood but not her memories. He lifted a hand in a small uncertain wave, and something inside her dipped, like a bird missing a step mid-flight. The farmhouse met them with the smell of damp stone and old timber, a sweetness of hay from somewhere under the eaves. The hall was cold enough to make breath smoke. He took her up the stairs that creaked like they were complaining at the weight, opened a door, and stood back, as if he were holding a lift for a stranger. The room was small, papered in a floral print the colour of weak tea, the pattern peeling where the wool bowed, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a window that looked towards the sea, where the horizon smudged into weather. "Right," he said, and the word fell between them like a dropped coin. He didn't stay. The door closed gently. Footsteps retreated. Patsy sat on the edge of the bed and put her suitcase on the floor without opening it. She watched the glass bead with rain and tried to picture her mother in this space, hanging up a cardigan, tucking sheets tight, laughing that the wallpaper was older than both of them. It didn't work. The room swallowed the picture whole. It would be wrong, she thought, to say he was unkind. He wasn't. He moved through the house like a careful ghost, attentive to tasks and to silence. Every morning he pulled on boots and a coat and disappeared to the barn. She heard the quiet industry of a life he had known before her, the slap of a stable door, the murmur he kept for animals he would not find for people, the scrape of a shovel, the click of a latch. He returned with mud at his cuffs and eyes that never seemed to settle on her for long. Sometimes he forgot to say good night. Sometimes she wanted to tap the air in front of him like a pane of glass and ask, "Can you see me?" In the evenings she learned the gentle map of the house by sound, the kettle starting to purr, the radio on the counter mumbling weather, the wind worrying the sash, the distant steady breath of the sea. She folded her clothes with the small, tight care of someone who thought neatness might keep the rest of her from spilling. She tried not to cry, because crying made everything echo. When tears came anyway, they surprised her with how quiet they were, how they ran without drama, the way a tap left half on will drip through the night. She thought a lot and said almost nothing. What if I'm a problem he can't solve? What if I learn the rhythm here and it still never sounds like home? What if the last thing of Mum left in the world is me, and I'm not enough? By the 7th week, she knew where the boards would groan, and which shelf in the pantry always smelt faintly of apples. She knew her father's day by the choreography of his hands, the way he dried a mug and stood it precisely on the dresser, the way his thumb tapped his wedding ring against the table when he was thinking, the way he fiddled with the television remote as if there might be a secret button for reversing time. At first, the TV was only a voice at the edges, newsreaders talking about a faraway illness the way people talk about storms that spoil other people's holidays. Words like precautions and monitoring, and no cause for alarm wrapped in polite, practiced calm. Then the tone changed. Not all at once, but like a kettle that you're sure is never going to boil, and then, somehow, the whole surface is trembling. Her father began to sit closer to the screen, as though being near it might make the facts kinder. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes narrowed. He turned up the volume until the voices flooded the room and made normal conversation feel like a trespass. The presenters started handing off to doctors who spoke fast and careful, their phrases stumbling over one another. Clusters, spread, unknown vector. A scrolling banner along the bottom pulsed numbers as if they were a heartbeat that had become too quick. Patsy stood in the doorway and watched him watch. He didn't notice her smallness there, or if he did, he folded it away as something to carry later. His jaw worked. His arms crossed tight over his chest, holding himself like a parcel that might come apart if not tied properly. Every hour she could see him shrink a fraction, the way wool pulls in under heat. She wanted to pull the blanket from the back of the sofa and tuck it around his shoulders and say, "It's scary, I know. We're both scared. We could be scared together. But fear makes people speak foreign languages, and neither of them knew how to translate yet." At night she lay with the window cracked open a finger's width and listened to the world she had arrived in. The sea moved in its sleep. The wind combed the grass. Somewhere out there, other houses held other televisions and other silences. Her mother's name hovered at the back of her throat, too heavy to lift, too sharp to swallow. She imagined the name written on the underside of the sky where, if she looked hard enough, she might read it and feel braver. Hope came to her in small, ridiculous shapes. 2 mugs, placed side by side on the draining board as if they might someday be used at the same time. A spare pair of wellies by the back door, mud dried in cheerful spatters. The way the morning light, on its best behaviour, made even the peeling wallpaper look like a decision rather than a failure. She cupped these things in her hands the way you protect a match from the wind. It felt like a kind of prayer, though she wasn't sure to whom. Each day the news spoke more urgently, but never said the thing she wanted. That the world would steady, that her mother would step back through the door trailing ordinary weather, that her father would turn and see her and find something to say that hurt and helped at once. So she learned to fill the space between those missing sentences with her own breathing, in and out, counting to 4. If she could keep count, she thought, maybe everything else would remember how. When the presenters finally said the words out loud, cases confirmed in England, something in her father's face altered in a way Patsy didn't have a name for. Fear had visited him before, at the graveside when he kept his jaw set as if clenching against weather, in the car when his eyes worked the mirrors like tally marks. But this was different. This was fear that had decided to stay. He stopped pretending to eat. A handful of crisps crushed to salt and oil on his palm. Half a biscuit abandoned on the arm of the chair. A beer cracked open and never finished, the bottle sweating a ring onto the table. The remote lived in his hand now, his thumb moving in small, frantic circles, turning the volume up as if volume could become control. The television made the walls vibrate, bright anchors, tired anchors, graphs with red climbing lines that had nowhere to go but up. The fields lost him. The ground waited and went unturned. The livestock began to call at odd hours, voices like unanswered questions rising from the hedgerows. When Patsy asked, careful as stepping stones, "What about the chickens?" he blinked as if she'd spoken in a language he used to know. He started and then didn't finish. The job passed to her not with instructions but with absence. So she learned it. She took the dented scoop from the nail by the coop and measured feed like it mattered to get it right. The hens came in a chuntering wave, their small feet pricking the earth. She talked to them because talking had to go somewhere. "You lot are greedy," she'd say, trying on her mother's voice like an old cardigan, "and don't pretend you're not." Their soft, ridiculous attention made a space in the day where she could put her fear down for a minute and straighten her shoulders. Inside, the news turned into a drum. Reports began to find a shape. An age line appearing where no age line should be, words like threshold and hormonal and puberty spoken softly, as if gentleness could blunt the edges. A doctor with dark circles under her eyes said, "We are seeing a pattern," and it sounded like an apology. Another, voice steady from too much practice, said, "Children under a certain age appear to be spared." Spared, Patsy thought, tasting the word like a coin. Spared meant chosen, and chosen meant left behind. Her father started switching the television off between updates and standing very still in the quiet, like he was listening for a second source of truth. His hands shook a little on the remote. Once, catching her watching him, he attempted a smile that only moved his mouth. He looked at her the way you look at a photograph you keep in your wallet, an outline you rub with your thumb until it fades. He didn't sit beside her or put an arm around her shoulders, though there was a space right there for it. He didn't say, "If anything happens to me, here's what you do." He didn't say, "I'm scared too." The unsaid piled up like mail on the hall table, and she stepped around it because stepping through it would mean admitting it was real. At night she did her counting breaths with the window cracked, the room tasting of salt and old plaster. She wondered, fiercely, secretly, if the line the doctors described ran through their house like a wire, if it hummed when she put her ear to it, if being 10 meant she had been placed on the safe side by someone who had not asked her permission. She imagined telling him, "I'm still here. You can be here with me." But the words dried to pebbles on her tongue. The morning it happened began with a different kind of quiet. Not the good quiet, the soft-edged one that held birdsong and distant surf. This quiet had corners. It had a pressure to it, as if the house had been wrapped in cling film. Patsy woke before the alarm she didn't set, lying very still, listening for the television's early murmur. Nothing. "Dad?" she called, her voice too loud at first, then smaller. "Dad?" The kettle was cool. A mug waited beside it with a tea bag gone dry. In the living room the armchair was empty, the throw slumped in the shape of last night's shoulders. The television screen showed her own reflection and the rectangular ghost of the window behind her. She stood there until her face blurred, then turned too quickly and knocked the mug so that it clinked and wobbled but did not fall. The back door stuck on damp and then gave with a sigh. Outside the air had that washed feeling after rain, the yard smelling of earth slapped flat. The barn doors were pulled to but not latched, one hanging a little crooked where the hinge had pulled from old wood. She knew, before she touched them, that they would move easily. She knew, before she stepped into the dim cool, that she would find him. He lay just inside, on his side, as if he'd meant to rest a moment and then remembered something urgent and tried to stand. One arm was tucked under him, the other drawn toward the light. His eyes were closed. The tightness that had lived around his mouth for weeks was gone, unknotted, leaving him almost young. The sight of that gentleness made her stomach pitch. It was kindness arriving after the person who needed it had already left. Patsy's knees went down hard on the floorboards. The barn smelt of oil and straw and the sweet metallic breath of old tools. Somewhere a swallow skittered in the rafters. She reached out and stopped a hand's width from his shoulder, her fingers floating there as if they could warm him by pretending. "Dad!" she said, and the word felt smaller than it had ever felt. The silence didn't give it back. She didn't cry. Not then. Tears required a softness she couldn't find. What she felt was a great hollowing out, like someone scooping the inside of her with a spoon and setting what they took aside where she couldn't reach it. She sat with him until the light began to change and the barn shifted its weight around them, and then she stood because standing was the next thing. After that, there were only tasks. She moved as if the day had laid boards across a flood, and she had to place her feet exactly or be swept. She found the spade, the one with the smooth worn handle, and the wheelbarrow with one soft tire. She chose a spot behind the ash tree where the ground was thinner and the roots ran like veins. She started to dig. The first clods came easily, then the earth grew stubborn, heavy as the lid of a trunk. Blisters rose and broke. Her breath hitched and kept going. When she was too tired to lift another shovelful, she sat in the grass and watched the sky refuse to do anything but be the sky. Moving him was a problem she did not let herself think about until she was doing it. She spoke to him under her breath the whole way, nonsense and apology. "Nearly there," she said, as if he could hear directions. "Nearly there." It was clumsy, and it was not how it should be, and there was no one to tell her otherwise. She did not look at his face. By the time the last of the earth was back in place, night had arrived properly. The stars were immodest and close. Her hands were raw, and her nails black crescents. She sat with her back against the ash and dirt under her thighs and let the quiet settle. She didn't mark the spot. A stone, a cross, his name. Any of it would make it a thing other people recognized, and there were no other people. More than that, to name it would be to admit that he had occupied a fixed point she had shared, and she was not ready to pin him to the map. She tilted her head back and looked up until the stars ran a little, and she pictured, without knowing why, 2 mugs on the draining board waiting side by side for morning. "I'm here," she told the dark, simple as that. It wasn't comfort. It was a fact, and for now facts were the only solid ground she had. For days she kept her mouth shut as if words were an expensive habit she could no longer afford. The house made its small, useful sounds without needing her. The tick of the kitchen clock, the wind worrying at the sash, the stove cooling with a metal sigh. She learned that if she did not speak, nothing echoed back to remind her how alone she was. When she needed to ask for something, a glass from the high shelf, a hand with the back door latch, she asked the air in her head and then fetched the step stool or worked the swollen wood until it gave. It was simpler to become a quiet creature that did the next thing and the next. One evening the silence grew too tight to wear indoors. She stepped outside with no plan and let her feet decide. The path down to the shore was a memory of a path, a ribbon of flattened grass between gorse and thrift. The sky had that rinsed, late light that made everything look briefly forgiven. She reached the sand and sat where the tide line had thrown up a glitter of shell and salt-smoothed glass. The sea moved and moved again, unbothered by anything human. "I don't know why I'm talking to you," she whispered, and felt instantly foolish for giving the water the dignity of an audience. The sea didn't answer, but it didn't leave either. It kept breathing its old breath, in and out, the way it had before her mother and would after her. That steadiness did something to the knot behind Patsy's ribs, loosening it one turn. After that she made a ritual of it. Eat something, wash the plate, set it to drain beside the second plate she still couldn't bring herself to move, pull on her coat and walk the path without needing to look. On the beach she would talk in the small, practical voice she used for chores. Some nights she narrated her day to the shoreline as if to a careful aunt, the way the kitchen tap coughed before running clear, the hen's enthusiastic insults, the tomato vine that had finally decided to try. Other nights she asked for a sign and stared at the horizon as if it might spell one, letter by letter, across the seam of sea and sky. When the tide came in close enough to dampen the hem of her trousers, she took it as an answer and went home. The chickens became a kind of parliament, fussy, demanding, alive. Each morning she lifted the rusted tin from its nail and scooped grain like a priest distributing wafers. The birds hurried to her in a warm, clucking tide, tilting their silly heads as though her arrival solved something only they fully understood. Sometimes she read them stories without a book, repeating fragments she remembered, lines about brave girls and stubborn gardens, until the words made sense again in her mouth. The eggs they laid were more than she could eat, the shells marbled with faint chalky swirls. She learned to boil them just so, to listen for the exact moment the simmer found its voice. The garden answered her patience with small, determined offerings. Carrots the size of her thumb, potatoes winked from the earth like forgotten coins, tomatoes that blushed slowly and then all at once. She weeded on her knees, the damp pressing through to her skin, and found a quiet pride in the grooves dirt left on her palms. Routine thickened around her. Feed, water, harvest, rinse, repeat, until it felt, if not like safety, then like a road she knew how to walk. It was the door that told her about the fox. Morning had come thin and grey. She stepped into the yard and saw the henhouse door yawning from one broken hinge, moving slightly as if embarrassed to be caught. The air had a raw, iron tang. Feathers were everywhere, ridiculous and weightless, floating against the ugliness they came from. Red streaks marked the threshold as though someone had written a message in a hurry and run out of words. Patsy's knees folded into the dirt without her permission. "Oh," she said, and then again, "Oh," as if the sound might undo what it named. She reached out and touched one of the hens with 2 fingers, as gently as she would have stroked a living thing. "I'm sorry," she whispered, apology tumbling into apology with nowhere to land. Tears came hot and sudden, cutting tiny clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. It wasn't just the loss, it was the waste of it, the stupid, senseless wreckage, the way the world kept taking without the courtesy of need. When the crying slid away, work remained. She fetched the spade and the sack and did what was required. She fixed the hinge badly and then better. She scrubbed at the red until the wood was only wood again. She sat back on her heels and made the kind of inventory that hurt. How long the potatoes would last, how soon before the tomatoes tired, what else in the pantry could be stretched, how much harder it would be to pretend she wasn't alone. The hens had been food, yes, but they had also been voices at the edges of the day, a living chorus reminding her that she was not the only heart beating. Their absence hollowed the morning into a cave. The rhythm she had built for herself, those stitched-together steps that had started to feel like something sturdy, unpicked in a matter of hours. The house seemed farther from the sea. The walk to the beach was longer. Even the clock in the kitchen, doing nothing but its old 1-2 duty, sounded out of step. She stood in the yard with the repaired door and the feather drift and felt the world tilt a fraction on its axis. The routine would hold, she told herself, because it had to, but it would not be the same. Something had come in the night and proved how easily the pieces came apart. That night she didn't talk to the sea. She sat on the cold, packed sand with her fists knotted in her lap and let the waves work in the dark, their white edges breathing and unbreathing. The words in her head wouldn't come out. They crowded behind her teeth like birds in a chimney, panicked and useless. She stared until her eyes stung and finally understood the simple arithmetic of it. If she stayed, she would thin out by degrees. First the food, then the days, then herself, until there was nothing left but a house full of careful ghosts. 15 miles to the village. She could see her father's finger moving across the paper map, the way he'd traced the road once like a vein back to a heart. Grocery here, he'd said. Hardware next door. Ordinary words from a time when ordinary still worked. She clung to that memory as if it were a handrail. She packed in the blue hour of morning when the kitchen felt like it belonged to no one. 2 bottles of water. The last 3 biscuits from the tin. The raincoat, because weather had no manners. She stood for a moment by the Land Rover, palm pressed to the cool metal as if it might purr awake and promise to carry her. She didn't know how to drive. The wanting of it was a small, sharp thing she put in her pocket with everything else she couldn't use. The road out was a faded ribbon, crazed with cracks and tufted with grass where tires had given up passing. Hedgerows breathed wildflower and wet soil, and underneath it a thinner smell she couldn't name, like something left too long in the sun. The silence had changed. It was no longer rest but refusal, the world keeping its mouth shut because it had run out of sentences. She walked and counted fence posts and told herself stories to keep her legs moving, the kind where a girl goes out and comes back with something the day didn't mean to give her. The sun climbed without ceremony and then leaned west. By the time she reached the village, the light had turned that soft, forgiving gold that makes even emptiness look briefly tender. Front doors opened to rooms that were still arranged for living. A mug on a coaster, a jumper folded on a chair back, a calendar paused on a month that had expected to be followed by another. The air in those houses felt recently exhaled. She moved through them gently, a guest in a place where the hosts had put their shoes on, and stepped out for 5 minutes that had become forever. At the shop she took a trolley and filled it with the kind of food that doesn't complain at being left alone, tins that clinked and stacked, pasta that whispered in its bag, biscuits that pretended at celebration with their scalloped edges. In the hardware store she found a garden trolley with fat, forgiving wheels and a handle that fit her hands like it had been waiting. She transferred the weight, testing how it rolled on the pavement, practical pride blooming at how well it obeyed. Then the paint, a row of cans lined up like small silent sirens, fluorescent yellow, She shook one and felt the marble rattle inside, the promise of noise and colour. The plan arrived complete, like a tune she realised she already knew. Messages. Arrows. A trail a frightened person could follow without having to think too hard. A way to say I am here to someone who could not yet answer back. Outside, she knelt on the warm pavement. The first burst of paint hissed and bloomed, a shock of sun against grey. The smell was sharp, solvent and future. Her hand steadied. In careful letters she wrote, "I'm still here. My name is Patsy. Please be kind and follow the arrows." She added the date, because days should be accounted for, and drew the first arrow pointing out of the square and towards the road like a patient finger. The yellow glared cheerfully, impossible to ignore. It looked like hope had learned how to shout. She hauled the trolley to a tidy semi with a gravel path and curtains set just so. The living room smelt of lemon polish and quiet. She left her boots by the door because it seemed rude not to. On the sofa she curled herself into a bracket of warmth and fabric, the room creaking its old, friendly creaks as if trying to remember how to make conversation. Sleep came in pieces. She dreamed footsteps that matched hers but arrived a moment late, and voices speaking from the next room in the polite tones of people who didn't want to wake a child. She woke twice, heart skittering, and lay still until the house settled around her again. By morning, the words of the dream had gone, but the feeling of being almost not alone clung like the scent of polish on her skin. The next day, on the walk back, she stopped wherever the road widened and the surface was clean enough to take paint. Cap off, rattle, hiss. She learned to steady her hand with her knee, to lay the letters slow and sure so they wouldn't blur in the rain. Between words she drew arrows, long and plain, pointing towards the coast. Each bright mark felt like a stitch in a torn map, a small repair no one had asked her to make. Each one a whisper of hope pressed into the skin of a world that had forgotten how to answer back. Days folded into themselves. She fell into a rhythm. Load the garden trolley, tag the shop fronts and the road junctions, date each message as if the calendar still held real weight, walk home with her palms tacky and her throat tasting faintly of solvent. She grew used to the sound of the trolley's big wheels over tarmac. Thrum, 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 a heartbeat to keep fear from finding its own. Sometimes, looking back, the yellow arrows caught the sun and flashed like small stubborn fires. She imagined someone, anyone, catching sight of that loud colour and thinking, not all the lights are out. On the 8th day she was more tired than careful. Her legs felt full of sand. Her eyes burned, grainy from wind and fumes. She climbed the last rise towards the farm with the trolley handle bumping her hip, the fields on either side gone the dull gold that means the day is nearly done. She was already rehearsing the small kindnesses of evening, wash her hands, light the stove, listen for the sea, when she saw the shape on the steps. A boy, sitting on the farmhouse threshold like a question she hadn't learned to ask. He held a half-empty water bottle with both hands, not drinking, just guarding it. As she came closer, his eyes widened, quick with something between hope and alarm. They stared at each other across the yard, two thin figures pinned by the late light, both of them still in the way creatures go still when the next movement might matter. He spoke first. "You wrote the message," he said. His voice was hoarse, the words as real as the grit under her shoes. Patsy opened her mouth, but nothing made it past the tightness in her throat. She swallowed. The air tasted of dust and old hay and the faint, sharp ghost of paint. She found herself counting again, 1, 2, 3, 4, until the world stopped tilting. The boy stood slowly, brushing at his jeans as if that might make him safer. Up close he looked younger than his height tried to claim, a smudge of dirt on his cheek, a hoodie too big at the sleeves, a caution in his shoulders that spoke of weeks spent making himself small. He didn't come down the steps, he didn't run either. "I didn't think there was anyone else left," he said, and the way he said it, like he'd been saving the sentence for the first person he could bear to give it to, made something tip inside her chest. Neither did I, she thought. Neither did I. But there he was, and he was breathing, and he'd followed sunshine letters on grey roads all the way to her door. She closed the last of the distance until they were near enough to see the salt line dried on each other's lips, the tired in each other's eyes. "You came all that way from the village?" she asked, and her voice sounded to her like a match struck in a large room. He nodded. I didn't have anywhere else to go. Patsy wet her lips and found her voice, small but steady. She had meant to say, I'm glad you found me. What came out was, Are you thirsty? He glanced at the bottle in his hands like he'd forgotten it was there. A bit. I've got more inside. She nodded toward the house, feeling the tug of war inside her between the part that wanted to run forward and the part that wanted to run away. Be kind, she'd written in the road. It felt like a promise she had to keep even if her hands shook. They moved carefully. The way animals approach a gate they're not sure is latched. She kept the door wide open as they crossed the threshold, the late light pouring in after them. In the kitchen, she set another bottle on the table and stood back so he could see she wasn't going to snatch it away. He unscrewed the cap and took a careful sip, then another, then 3 in quick succession before he stopped himself and lowered it, embarrassed by his own need. Up close he looked older and younger at once, the sharpness of hunger along his cheeks, the soft uncertainty around his mouth. Dust sat in his eyebrows like pale salt. He held himself as if he expected a loud noise. I'm Patsy, she said finally, because names felt like anchors you threw into rough water. He swallowed. Callum. The word came out hoarse, as if his throat had to remember how to make it. He looked at her as though waiting for the name to be refused. Hi, Callum. It sounded ordinary, and for a second, the ordinariness was almost unbearable. She found a tin of beans and the good opener that didn't slip, set a pan on the hob, and let the small domestic noises do the talking. The click of the igniter, the gentle hiss and bloom of flame, the quiet plink-plink of beans hitting metal. Callum watched her hands like he was memorizing how to belong in a kitchen again. When the beans were warm, she split a stale heel of bread and toasted it over the ring until it singed at the edges. They ate at the table with spoons, heads bent, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of things you don't quite know how to say yet. Thank you, he murmured, halfway through, as if he'd found a place in the sentence where the words could fit without spilling. You followed the arrows, she said. All of them? He nodded. From the shop to the junction, then the lane with the broken sign. I slept in a bus shelter one night. He rubbed at his sleeve, a small automatic motion. I kept thinking maybe I'd made you up. People do that, don't they? Make voices when it's too quiet. Patsy felt something unclench, painful and sweet. Me too, she said, and surprised herself by smiling. I mean, I thought I was imagining you just now, on the steps. The smile he gave her back was small and careful, like a bird landing on a wire. He ate the last of the beans more slowly, as if teaching his body there would be another meal after this one. When the light thinned to blue, she lit the lamp on the dresser and the room gentled around them. She laid a blanket on the floor near the stove and another beside it, side by side like 2 lines finally meeting. You can stay here if you want, she said, and the sentence felt like stepping onto a new bit of ground and finding it held. Callum glanced at the open door and then at her, reading the space as if it were a map. If that's okay. It is. She heard her mother's voice in her own then, firm, kind, certain, and held on to it. It's okay. Outside, the last of the day bled out of the sky. Inside, the little room learned 2 names and began to warm to them. Patsy sat on the step between kitchen and hall, listening to the stove tick and to Callum's breaths even out into sleep, and for the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel like an enemy. It felt, shyly, cautiously, like the pause before the next sentence. Later, when the stars came out and pressed their cold faces to the panes, Patsy coaxed the kitchen fire back from its sulk. Kindling, breath, patience, until the first shy flame caught and bloomed into something that sounded like company. Callum sat close enough to feel the heat, but not so close that he'd have to move if it flared. When she tipped a tin of beans into the pan and found 2 dusty crackers at the back of the cupboard, he watched as if the act of warming food were a kind of magic he'd forgotten the trick to. He ate fast at first, 2 quick mouthfuls, 3, then slowed, as though teaching his body not to be afraid of the next spoonful. He held the spoon with both hands, the way a smaller child might, bracing it as if it might vanish mid-air. That told her more than any story. Hunger had edges, it made you careful. When he caught her looking, he ducked his head a flush beneath the dirt and murmured a thank you that sounded like apology. After, she showed him the garden by lamplight. The rose looked brave in the dark, neat stripes stitched into the earth. When Callum grinned, it was sudden and boyish and made him briefly lighter. "You did all this?" he asked, crouching to peer at the stubborn little leaves as if they might whisper back. "Mostly they did it themselves," she said. "My father put them in. I've just tried not to mess them up." He touched a frill of carrot tops with the back of his finger, reverent. "Still," he said, and that single word felt like a hand placed gently on what she'd managed to hold together. In the morning they took to the work like they were learning a dance, awkward at first, then finding the beat. Patsy carried water in the dented can while Callum lifted the wire cloches. They knelt shoulder to shoulder and teased weeds from the soil, laying the green threads in a tidy accusing heap. At the traps she'd set along the hedge, they found nothing but a tuft of rabbit fur snagged on bramble. "They're clever," Callum said, trying for a joke and nearly making it. She smiled anyway. It was enough. The rhythm of having someone beside her felt strange in her bones, like wearing a jumper that had belonged to someone else. She kept waiting for the day to split where it had been joined, for the trick of companionship to flicker and go out. But it didn't, not right away. The work moved more quickly with 4 hands. The silences changed shape, less like gaps and more like rests in a piece of music that knew where it was going. At night they took the old mattress from the lean-to and dragged it into the living room, grunting and laughing breathlessly when it snagged on the door frame. They set it near the stove and made a small fort out of blankets, the kind of silly barricade children build against nothing and everything. Lying back to back, they could feel each other breathing. It steadied the room. Callum admitted, in a voice small enough to be misplaced if you weren't careful, that sleep had been full of shadows lately. "They come right up close," he said, eyes on the ceiling. "Sometimes I wake up and I don't know if I'm awake." "If they come here," Patsy said, surprising herself with the certainty in it, "we'll tell them to go away." He huffed a laugh, that near-silent kind you make when you don't want to frighten good luck, and after a while his breaths lengthened. Patsy listened to the stove tick and the night settle outside and thought that hope, when it arrived, had a heartbeat you could lean your shoulders against. It wasn't perfect. Some mornings were buoyant, the garden generous, the sea friendly at the edges. Others were heavy as wet wool. Callum could be prickly, especially when tired. There was a fear in him that came out sideways. The map brought the worst of it. It was a grubby road atlas they'd found in a kitchen drawer, the spine cracked where Wales opened like a book already read too often. He'd traced the lines so many times the paper had gone soft under his finger. When she leaned in, trying to follow the route he was working out, he snapped, sharp as a wire drawn too tight. "It's not like I don't know where we're going," he muttered. "You know I do." The words stung more than she thought they would. She stepped back, palms up, the way you do with a skittish animal. "Okay," she said, and that was all. She took herself outside before her face could give her away. Down at the shore, the wind came off the water with teeth. She stood ankle-deep where the waves curled and uncurled and let the roar of it take her voice. She screamed until it scraped her throat raw. Hoarse, she corrected herself automatically, the way her mother would have. Then screamed again for the things you can't say in a small house with someone else breathing beside you. When the world had taken what it wanted, she stood with her hands on her knees and breathed until the shaking in her legs turned to simple tiredness. By the time she walked back up the path, the light had thinned to evening and the farmhouse wore its long shadows. Callum was on the steps, elbows on his knees, looking smaller than the hoodie made him. When he saw her, he stood too quickly, then seemed to think better of it and sat again, as if rehearsing not to bolt. "Sorry," he said before she reached him. He didn't look at her. I didn't want you to think I'm useless. I'm not." Patsy took the step below his and sat so their shoulders were almost level. For a moment she watched a gull wheel and scold over the field as if there were still a flock to impress. "I don't think you're useless," she said, and felt how true it was as she said it. It never crossed my mind. He nodded once, hard, The set of his mouth loosened. Okay. They didn't say more. They didn't need to. The kitchen would need sweeping. The beans would need soaking. The sea would keep doing its old patient job, whether they watched it or not. When they went inside, they left the door ajar, the last of the warm daylight reaching in to touch the map on the table. It lay open to the page where thin roads ran inland in spider-fine lines, and for the first time since she'd taken it from the drawer, Patsy didn't hate the way it spoke of leaving. It looked, instead, like a promise, one they might someday make together. It was after one of those quiet days, the kind where they moved around each other like careful shadows, that he said it. They were sitting cross-legged in the garden with their bowls, the soil still warm and the insects starting their evening arguments in the hedge. Smoke from the stove drifted in thin ribbons. The light did that soft, generous thing it did before it left. "I think we should go," Callum said, not looking at her at first. He traced a fork tine through the dirt, a shaky line that didn't quite commit. "To Aberystwyth. It's the nearest big town. There might be others like us, or supplies. Answers, even." His mouth twisted around the last word. The not knowing. He stopped, swallowed. "We're kids. Are there any grown-ups left? Anyone who knows what to do?" Patsy followed the line of his fork to the horizon. The fields ran out there. Beyond them, the sea she'd whispered to and the road she'd stitched with bright arrows. She'd held on for so long. First to Mum, then to the house, then to routine, gripping each thing until her fingers ached. Letting go felt like stepping off the only solid bit of ground. But when she looked at Callum, at the dirt under his nails and the evening sun burning copper in his hair, she realized the fear had changed shape. She wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. She was afraid of losing this boy who breathed beside her, this small, improbable tether back to the world. She was afraid to trust that it might be real, that this life was hers now and could be added to rather than only taken from. But she had to know. Not knowing was its own kind of hunger. "Okay," she said at last. The word felt like lifting something heavy and finding it moved. "But only if we go together." He looked up then, and the relief in his face was like a door opening to a warm room. "Wouldn't want to go anywhere without you," he said, slow and quiet. "We're a team. You're my best friend." "Yeah," she said, and let herself smile because it was true in a way that didn't need measuring. "I'm your only friend." He huffed a laugh, the real kind that showed his teeth, and she couldn't help laughing too. They bumped fists, awkward and perfect. "The decision's set then," she said, hearing the steadiness in her own voice. "Let's eat and get some sleep. We've a long way to go." They finished in companionable silence, scraping bowls clean with the last of the bread. Afterwards they spread the map on the kitchen table and pressed the creases flat, weighing the corners with whatever came to hand. A jar of nails, the salt, the smooth stone she kept from the beach. Callum traced the road with a gentler finger than the one he'd used earlier, naming the small places as if that might conjure their lights back on. Bow Street, Llanbadarn, the bridge over the river. She made a list in the margin in her neatest writing. Torches, batteries, water plasters, spare socks. He added things she wouldn't have thought of. String, bin bags, a whistle. They planned without saying the other thing, that planning made leaving real. They did not talk about the ash tree behind the house or what lay beneath it. They did not talk about the sea, which would keep breathing whether she told it the news or not. When the shadows drew long enough to spill into the hall, they packed what they could. The garden trolley, checked and checked again. 2 rucksacks with their straps tightened down to fit. She slipped the can of yellow paint into the side pocket. He tucked the atlas into his hoodie like a secret. At the door she paused, palm flat on the wood, and listened to the house breathe. Thank you, she thought, unsure who she meant. The walls, maybe. The days that had held. They dragged the old mattress back to the living room and built their small fortress anew. Back to back, shoulders touching, they lay listening to the stove tick itself cooler and the wind find its old paths round the eaves. Callum's breath evened out first. Patsy watched the wavering lamplight and pictured the road in the morning, its pale ribbon, its quiet promise. She thought of her arrows, bright as shouting, and how tomorrow's would point away from home for the first time. Sleep came gentle, and when it took her it felt less like falling and more like stepping over a threshold. Somewhere between waking and dreaming, she heard her mother's voice. Not words this time, but the tone she used when work was hard and necessary. Up early. Good shoes. Don't forget water. Be brave, but be careful. At first light, the map would fold to the right page. The door would close softly behind them. Two small figures would set off down a long, patient road. And whatever waited ahead, others, answers, or only more of the wide, empty world, they would meet it together.
This was An Empty World, written by Beryl Coops. I hope you enjoyed my short story. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. I have written over 500 short stories over the years under many pen names. I will be updating these and recording them under the Beryl Coops name. I will be listing them on YouTube as fast as we can get them recorded. They will include historical drama, humor, adventure, romance, period drama, mystery, thriller, war stories, spy stories, revenge, horror, psychological horror, dystopian, disaster, children's stories, love stories, and more. Too many to name. Something for everyone. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up. It helps others find my channel. Until next time, thank you for listening to the end.